Today is Monday, September 18th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. In some of my recent studies on the history of the Constitution, one of the discussions that I found interesting has been some of the arguments against monarchical government, and you can find these in some of the clearest arguments were in Thomas Paine's Common Sense. But if you really ask what was it that the Americans hated about monarchy, what was the principal argument against monarchy? What the Americans really hated was the idea of hereditary succession. The Americans hated the idea that the king should be replaced by his son, or if there's no son, by a near relative. They really thought that that was the dumbest idea for government, made no sense, and led to endless trouble. And they had a principle that they argued. They argued that virtue is not hereditary. Virtue is not hereditary. Now, when we think of monarchy, we often name some of history's greatest and most virtuous kings. We can name great ancient rulers like King David and King Solomon, or King Cyrus of Persia. We can talk about virtuous Roman emperors or kings of Sparta. We think about great English and French kings like St. Louis or King Richard the Lionheart. It's easy to think of examples from history of heroic, virtuous kings. And when we talk about monarchy and when we think about monarchy, we often take it for granted that one of those men would be sitting on the throne. But what we don't take thought of is what happens when the heirs of those men who are nothing like them succeed them. And these great kingdoms are handed over to fools. And this was the reality of monarchy that the Americans pointed out and fought against. They hated the idea of hereditary succession. Even when you get into the formation of the American government, the reason why election by the people and short term limits was so crucial to the new government was because they wanted no kind of succession whatever. The people had to choose new rulers, new leaders constantly. And a constant theme, as I said before, was that virtue is not hereditary. Virtue is not hereditary. And you can think of endless examples from history of virtuous men being followed by vicious children. That's the norm. When I was a Protestant, I had one great Protestant pastor when I was in college, Pastor Albert Martin in New Jersey. He was a Reformed Baptist pastor. And I remember him teaching as a Baptist that God has no grandchildren. He used to say that all the time. God has no grandchildren. No one goes to heaven because their father was a Christian. God has no grandchildren. You're either a believer yourself and a son of God, or you're not. There's no hereditary salvation. God has no grandchildren. He only has sons and daughters. That was a great lesson, and it relates to this political principle that virtue is not hereditary. And like I said, we can think of endless examples of virtuous men having children who do not imitate their virtue. And when we find examples of virtuous men being followed by virtuous sons, that's actually a rarity. That's a rarity. However, even though that's true, most of us who have chosen to marry and have children have expected that our faith and our virtue, our beliefs, our disciplines will be taken up by our children. And if you look around in Christian circles, you'll find that in most places that's not true. It may be true to a degree, but it's very rarely true. And it's really stupid for us to expect that, because we know ourselves that the good that's in us, the faith that's in us, the love, the hope that's in us, the virtue that's in us, we know that all of these good things that are in us by the grace of God. We understand that. I understand that my experience, which was orchestrated by God at every step, caused me to think and believe and to act the way I do. And I know that my children have none of that experience. I know that bad things I experienced as a kid, bad things I did as a teenager, those have all contributed to develop my adult Christian character. And my kids would never have those same experiences. And yet, I, as a father, unreasonably expected that my kids would think like me, believe like me, talk like me, act like me, enjoy the things I enjoy, dislike the things I dislike, and so on. And one of the hardest lessons that I've had to learn as a Christian is that expectation is not only false, but really irrational. It really doesn't make any sense. There's no reason why I should expect my children to be like me when I intentionally give them a different life than I had. And even if I reflect on the scriptures, I'm told in the scriptures that expectation is unrealistic and irrational. Jesus said, "Those who are forgiven much love much." And we read stories of the saints where the greatest sinners experience God's mercy and become the most charitable, heroic saints because of that great sense of forgiveness. And it's very difficult for quote-unquote good kids to experience that, just as it's difficult for kids raised in wealth to appreciate money, as a child who is raised in poverty would appreciate money. Those who are given much usually take it for granted, and those who have to live with little usually appreciate every little bit they get. And this is true of grace as well. and forgiveness from God. Those of us who were raised with little and received much, appreciate it so much because we remember what it was like to live without it and how differently our lives are with it. And there's no way for us to pass that appreciation down to our children. There's no way. They have to go through their own experience. God has to orchestrate their own life. They have to work out their own salvation. And their journey, their path, inasmuch as the circumstances of their life are completely different than ours were, their path to that realization is going to be very different from ours. Now, the reason why I'm talking about this is because I'd like to talk about a problem that I see that I myself and my wife together fell into, and which I see most other Christian parents falling into. And I think that once I talk about this, it's just going to be so obvious that you're not going to believe you ever thought otherwise. And yet, you'll see that it's in our Christian culture, the normal way we do things, the normal way we think about things, just makes no sense at all. And it has to do with this principle that virtue is not hereditary. Now, as we look at the world and think about God's will and the mission of the church and all of the opportunities that exist for things to get done in the world, as Catholic adults, what do? We think, oh man, I am going to work so hard to raise my children to become priests and monks and nuns and teachers and doctors and lawyers and politicians and all of these important persons in society where we need Christians to go in and direct temporal affairs according to God's will. I'm going to devote myself to training my children, educating my children, and raising saints. That's what I'm going to do because the world needs Christian people. The world needs Christian people, and if we don't raise saints, if we don't raise our children to love God and to know the truth and to live virtuously, it's just going to get worse and worse. And that's how the Christian adult thinks. It's how almost every Christian adult thinks. Every married Christian adult. They think of how they're going to order their home and raise their children, train their children, educate their children, teach their children to try and fix this broken world in some way. And this response to the problem is totally unreasonable. Because virtue is not hereditary. We think that the faith that we have and the charity that we have, the hope that we have, the courage that we have, is just all going to be passed on to our children. And what we don't realize is that these virtues have not been given to our children, and they may never be given to our children. They're given to us, the adult Catholics. They're given to us the Catholic men, the Catholic women, they're given to us. They're not guaranteed to our children. And as experience shows, they're very rarely reproduced in our children. And I think this is sort of a delusion by which we who have received grace and do have the gifts and virtues and motivation to influence the world for good, instead of actually taking those works upon ourselves, we think that we're supposed to raise children to do those works. And it's uncertain that our children will share our faith and virtues, and therefore we end up often influencing nothing at all. We spend ourselves on this effort to raise children to do good works without realizing that while we're doing that, we're neglecting to do good works that we're equipped to do. We talk about raising kids who will grow up to be political leaders and influential Christians, and yet we do not seek to become political leaders or influential Christians. We talk about raising children who will grow up to be religious, and yet with religious vocations open to us, at least as concerns lay vocations, we don't take them up. We think we're going to raise children who will become great evangelists or preachers or teachers, but we who have faith and are motivated to do these things don't do them. And we tell ourselves we're going to raise children who do them. And this makes no sense, because we're given the grace to do these things, and instead of doing them, we pretend that we're going to cause our children to do them, and we have no means to bring that about. And it rarely comes about. Now, I have wonderful children. I have strong, hardworking, studious children. I have great relationships with my children. But my children do not have my faith. My children do not think of God the way I think of God. My children do not think of God as the priority of their lives, as I have since I was 19 years old. When I was a college student, when I was a young professional, I always put religion first. I scheduled my life around my religious obligations. I can't explain how I had the strength and wisdom to do that. It was grace. I was doing things that seemed obvious to me, not realizing how unobvious they were. And I expected that my kids would do the same thing, because that's what I did, and I would just tell them what to do and tell them what I did, and they would do it. And I realized as they were growing up that there was in me, as a young adult, a fear of God and a love for God and a desire for God that was unique. And I really took it for granted. I didn't appreciate how unique it was. And this isn't boasting in any way. If you've experienced God's grace, you know what I'm talking about. The good that was in me was from outside of me. And I just assumed that that would also be in my children if I just told them how to think and how to live and what to do. And what I had to learn by very difficult experience, by very confusing experience, is that this is not something that's just taught to other people. You don't just teach faith. You don't train hope. The Catechism teaches this explicitly. It's grace that's infused into the soul by God Himself. That faith and that hope that was in me came from God directly. And I did not have the ability to give it to my children. That virtue is not hereditary. Grace is individual. And you see the error in choosing to not put that grace to work in our own life as individuals through our own works, but to think that we're simply going to reproduce it in our children and have them do the work. It doesn't happen. And in the end, the work that we could have done goes undone, and we end up with less than we should have. And so what I'd like to argue here is that as Catholics, we think about this and ask, are we taking the unique grace that we have received, and instead of putting it to work through our own adult works right now, are we basically gambling with that grace and hoping that we can reproduce it in our kids and leave the works for them to do? Because that's what I think we're doing. I think we're gambling with the grace that we've received, and we're sort of going like double or nothing. We've taken the money that's been given to us, and instead of putting it to good work, we're putting it down at the blackjack table with a hope of multiplying it, without thinking carefully of the fact that we're more likely to lose it and end up with nothing. And the works that God has equipped us to do, we don't have the right to delegate them to our children, but we're gifted, we're equipped to do them ourselves. It took me a long time to realize this, my wife as well. It took us a long time to realize this, and thankfully we figured it out while we had time to fix it and get to work. My wife and I, when we had children, we looked forward to the day when our children might become priests and religious and pursue great learning and do all kinds of great works. And we started to think and talk about things and realize that there's no guarantee that they would ever do those things. And then we looked at the actual vocations and works that were available to be done, and we realized we could be doing those things ourselves right now. Why are we leaving them undone and thinking that our kids will do them? There's no reason to think like that. And so, rather than trying to raise saints or raise kids who choose religious vocations, my wife and I said, we should be lay Dominicans ourselves and stop talking about the kids becoming religious. There are vocational paths for us that we're neglecting while we talk unreasonably about our children pursuing religious vocations. That's not how the church even works. Religious vocations are for us, not for children. They're for adults. They're present. They're for those who have grace, those who are called, not for those who might have grace or who might be called, who might respond to God's grace. They're for those who do respond to God's grace, and that's us, not our children. And so my wife and I chose to pursue a vocation as lay Dominicans. And all of a sudden, all of that confusion in our life was taken away. And we realized it wasn't for our children to do those things, it was for us to do those things. The same is true with education. We have opportunities to study and learn and do things and pursue all sorts of studies and great works in this life, and we're raising children talking about them doing these things. Parents spend so much time talking about how they're going to pay for their kids to go to college and how they're going to afford for their kids to get degrees and all these things, and what they don't explain is why they're not going to college, why they're not getting degrees, why they're not undertaking these studies and these works. And they start with all kinds of financial arguments, but these things aren't true. These arguments aren't true. It's not even how college finances work. We have no guarantee that our children will even be interested in great learning, or that they'll be interested in learning for the sake of religion. And there are so many sources of financial assistance available to our children that they really aren't dependent on having their parents pay their tuition. That's not even how college is designed to work. I have 4 children in college right now. 3 of them are in the military. 2 of them are in ROTC. 1 is in the reserves. All of their college expenses are paid for. And they receive military pay for their ROTC and military activities. They need nothing. They need some help with simple expenses like a car payment, some gas money, an occasional help with some fees or something that come up. They have need of nothing. Our 4th child, when it was time for her to apply to school, she applied to school, and she reports in her application for financial aid that she has 3 siblings in college, and she receives grants and financial assistance that pays all the costs of her studies. There's no great need of all this money from parents. That's not how the college system is even designed to work. We create this story about how kids are so expensive and we have to have all of this money saved up in college savings accounts and all. When you do that, the colleges take that money. But if you don't do that, the colleges don't need that money. The colleges don't need for the parents to pay for their adult children's college expenses, nor do the children need their parents to pay that. And I realized that because I paid for my own college education. It's just not even how these things work. But we follow this script that has become popular, and we actually cause these things to work out in worse possible ways than they would work out if we lived otherwise. For example, instead of saving all of our money, well, let me give you a couple different insights into this. If I take money that I earn and use it to pay my children's college tuition, that's considered personal income and a personal expense. That money is going to be taxed. The government doesn't intend for us to do that. However, if I'm a teacher, if I'm a business owner, more specifically, and I choose, rather than spend money on my children's college studies, but spend it on my own college studies for the sake of my business, it's a business expense that's tax deductible. In other words, the government says, if you do this, you owe no taxes on that money. So it's obvious that financially it would be better for me to spend money for myself to go to college than for my children, especially because the resources are already in place to allow my children to go to college. But my career, which my children are dependent upon, would be benefited by my own studies, by my own pursuit of advanced degrees and studies that apply to my profession. The same is true with my wife. And so the idea of saving up all of this personal income to spend on children's college expenses really is not the best use of the money. And taxation reveals that the government would prefer that we use the money to invest in professional development of our own rather than in the education of our children. So my wife and I decided to do that. Rather than worry about our children's college costs, which, by the way, were already provided for, and again, we didn't expect that because we listen to other people and think that what they say must be true, and then find that it's not true. It's true because they've caused it to be true. If I apply, for example, if my children apply to college for financial aid, and that's just how you handle college expenses, through financial aid. They're asked questions like, how many members of your household are currently in college? They ask questions like, how much do your parents have in savings? And based on these answers, they determine the amount of money that your parents are expected to pay towards your college expenses. But the problem is that the parents actually put themselves in the position that requires the maximum payment from the parents. And that's not even necessary. That money that's stashed away for children's college expenses isn't necessary for children's college expenses and could be put to better use. But this mentality where we think that all of the work that needs to be done, all of the studies that need to be done by our children, leads us down this stupid path. And we end up handing all of our money over to colleges that didn't even need that money, but saw that we had set it aside and took it. We create that situation by choice. And it makes no sense. How many parents fight and fight and fight to make more money, only to cause themselves to become liable for expenses that our government has already provided for. That's how our country operates. And if you think, well, isn't that sort of an abuse of the government? No, it's how the country works. It's the reason why the colleges set tuition at the numbers they do, because it's a system. It's really ridiculous, but it's a system. For example, Belmont Abbey College is a private Catholic college about an hour from us. They set their tuition based on the normal financial aid numbers that the government is willing to pay. And it's so absurd that colleges do this that it costs just about the same to take graduate study courses at Belmont Abbey College, which is a nobody's school, than to take them at Harvard. But that's how the system works. Parents think, well, local school's more affordable. Local school, maybe we can't afford to go to the state university. We'll go to a smaller school, a cheap, more affordable school. That's not even how the system works. If you look up U.S. News and World Report's college rankings and look for the rankings of colleges that are the best value, the number one best value college is Harvard University. The number two best value college is Princeton University, and it goes on to Stanford and Yale and so on. Best value, because the way parents think college works is not how it works. Harvard University has a $53 billion, that's billion with a B, $53 billion endowment. That means that Harvard University has $53 billion in savings and investments that it collects interest on, and it runs the university on the interest from its endowment. Harvard University doesn't even need to collect tuition from students. And over 50% of students receive financial aid in the form of grants. I think at Princeton it's over 60%. The elite colleges are not even concerned with money. The people who are always talking about college and money are the Christian parents. They're the ones who believe that college is like buying a car. You have to save up, you have to borrow money, you have to pay the full price for the car. And it's just all about this transaction, this buying and paying. And that's not even how college education works in America. Parents are trying to teach their kids about respecting the value of a dollar. So how do you do that? You make the kids go get part-time jobs so they spend 20 hours a week to earn $125. For what? For what purpose? All the colleges, the great colleges, all they care about is academic achievement. Nobody cares that a kid works a part-time job. There's no need for any kid to work a part-time job. If a kid is a minor at home, he can just focus on his studies and achieve as much as possible and go to a university. It doesn't even matter if mom and dad have any money. Financial assistance is available. You say, oh, well, student loans are primarily for the kids who go to inferior colleges that don't have endowments and have no way to help the students. And those students have to take out student loans because there's no money available. It's for low achievers. The student loans are for low achievers attending colleges that have less resources. High achievers that can gain admission to the greatest universities don't even have to worry about money. If they would just focus on academic achievement, the money would be taken care of. But Christians don't think like this. And so the parents spend their time stashing all their money away, working and saving and saving and saving in their college savings accounts so they can hand all of that money over to a college that wouldn't even have asked for it if the parents didn't have it. If the parents would have spent all of that money on their own professional development, and there's a lot of issues here, like self-employment and things. And again, because the parents choose the easy way and decide to be employees, they pay all kinds of consequences for that. Because rather than pursue great Christian works, rather than pursue great lay apostolates, they're always trying to live this cautious, financially obsessed life, trying to save up and invest in the future rather than in the present. And they just lose everything in the end. It makes no sense. And yet this is the norm. Instead of thinking of the needs in the world and projects that need to be done, works that need to be done, they think their children will do all those things. And what ends up happening in the end is that none of it gets done. Now, our circumstances all differ. And I've got to realize that I chose to go into Christian education. And so at this phase in my life, I'm sort of reaping all of the benefits of that life. But I think that hammers home the point that I'm making, which is that if we would just pursue these things from the beginning, we would find that everything else takes care of itself. And as I say that, I'm thinking of what Jesus taught us in Matthew 6:33. Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you. I can testify that I sought to do Christian work as a matter of principle. I had no idea what it meant for all these things would be given to you. I had no idea. I have never had an idea as I've gone through my adult life. But I've watched, especially now, because it's sort of the rewards are beginning to really ramp up. I'm seeing now that the way the world works is actually the opposite of how everyone seems to think it works. The people who make finances a priority end up giving all their finances away, or having it all taken from them in taxes and all of these costs and payments that they're made to pay. And those who devote themselves to religion, charitable works, necessary Christian apostolates, and so on, they're given these things. They're given these things. Just look at the lives of religious. Look at the lives of Dominicans who are sent to study philosophy and theology in Rome. Who has it better? Who has it better? And you can just see these two different lives that are lived. We often think that the kids and the people who are living these great lives must just be incredibly wealthy. They must just have hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars that they spend. And if we would investigate and look into the thing, we find that their lifestyle is actually not very dependent on cash at all. It's that they live within a system of life. They live within the real working of the world. And what gives them the wisdom to do that is having honorable priorities and pursuing them. The adults pursue the opportunities. The adults pursue the works. The adults don't try to raise their children to pursue them and end up doing everything the opposite of how it's designed to work. And they just get punished by the system for trying to pass the work off onto others, by trying to take the easy route, just be the employee, just collect the paycheck, stash the money away. Just that way of life just gets crushed by the system. Whereas those who just focus on the works themselves, who pursue the studies themselves, who pursue the apostolates themselves, who take up the religious vocations themselves, they don't have any of those troubles. And this is what I think we really have gotten wrong as Christian parents. This idea that we're going to raise kids to do what we're equipped to do. And to allow all of these concerns about, well, what are we going to eat? What are we going to wear? How are the kids going to go to college? What are the kids going to do about what? We allow all these questions to excuse us from the works that God has equipped us, the adults, to do. And we justify our behavior, we justify our neglect of these works by saying, oh, well, we're going to raise saints, we're going to raise great kids, And this idea is not taught anywhere. We don't even know if our kids are going to remain in the faith. We don't even know if our kids are going to choose to live as Catholic adults. And we're making all of the Catholic works dependent on younger people whom may not even be Catholics. And so it's very obvious that that's not how it's supposed to work. We're the adults right now. We're the ones who are supposed to be doing these works. We're the ones who are supposed to be studying and gaining wisdom and serving the church. We're the ones who are supposed to be doing these things, not our children. And if you're a Christian parent, if you simply flip this switch, I think you'll be amazed as you learn how things work, how everything falls into place. Why would your children be interested in virtuous works or religious vocations when you are not interested in these things? How do you think your children will think that your advice to them about what they should do is trustworthy when you yourself don't do those things? Now flip the switch. You do those things. Now think about your children who have parents who are studying, who are engaged in Christian works, who take upon themselves Christian works, who take upon themselves religious vocations. And think what a different world your children grow up looking at. It's very different. I know because my wife and I did it, and when we made the change, our whole relationship with our children changed. And our children went from having parents who tell them what to do to being children who watch their parents do things that are honorable and virtuous. And we don't need to talk about it anymore because we're doing it. And there was so much stress, so much confusion, so much frustration in parenting because we were following this culture of raising children to do great things instead of realizing that we're the ones who are supposed to be doing the great things. As soon as that switch flipped, everything changed. Because virtue is not hereditary. God has no grandchildren. He has sons and daughters, and those sons and daughters are the ones that are living now as adults. The clock on our adult lives and our adult works, the clock is ticking on our adult works, and instead of doing those works, we're talking about our kids doing them as if we're just going to pass our grace onto them, which is obviously false. The works are for us. We need to do them.